Assassins, to another episode of the Dark Assassins podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. I'm not sure about you guys, but this week I felt a great disturbance in the Force, as if millions of wallets suddenly cried out in terror and then were suddenly silenced. I fear that something terrible has happened. And what that thing is, we will get into in this week's episode. But before we do that, let's start off with our trivia question for the week, which is: PDFs are ubiquitous in today's digital world, but what does PDF actually stand for? So what does PDF actually stand for? And that is your trivia question for the week. Now, getting into some Apple news, no, not that Apple news, the other Apple news. So Apple announced and has been touting their Apple Intelligence pretty much any chance they get, pretty much since WWDC this year. And as part of that, they've also been touting their private cloud compute platform as well. Now, essentially what the idea of the private cloud compute platform is, if you either forgot or aren't aware, the idea is essentially if your device isn't powerful enough to handle the AI task at hand that you're asking of it, you'll send that request and any requisite data to the cloud, and the cloud will process that information and return to you the result. Now, of course, this comes with the obvious red flags of what about user privacy? Because historically speaking, any time that you would send your precious data off to the cloud for the cloud to do some kind of compute resourcing for you, there was usually a cost to that usage, whether that was through a subscription service on your end, or you gave them the rights to the data that you provide to them for them to do whatever they please, whether that's training their own AI systems or, in other very common circumstances, selling that data to third parties. So there, of course, was some obvious, pushback, hesitancy when users heard that Apple, the supposed privacy champion, was openly telling their users that they were going to be sending their data to the cloud for processing. And I think rightly so. Apple saw this coming, and they came up with a game plan, strategy, whatever you want to call it, to mitigate this and try to put people's concerns and thoughts at ease. And their solution, of course, was the private cloud compute platform. Now, the benefits of this are obviously quite notable, right? So, of course, you have the massive benefit of offloading, these very intensive computations to the cloud while also ensuring your data privacy. So, assuming that their claims are to be believed, that they don't actually harvest any of your data, they don't see any of your data, and you just get the benefits of the offloaded computation and also the benefits of data privacy, that's basically the best of both worlds. Now, when Apple announced this Apple Intelligence and private cloud compute back at WWDC, they encouraged everyone, specifically security researchers and privacy researchers, but literally anyone, to perform their own independent investigation into their claims that their platform is indeed secure and the data on the platform is secure, and Apple isn't siphoning off, a copy of that data to either train their AI models or sell to third parties or anything like that. But up until this point, Apple Intelligence was never really a thing. Now, of course, with the rollouts of iOS 18.1 and macOS Sonoma 15.1 and all the point 1 updates for the latest releases of the software, Apple Intelligence features are slowly starting to roll themselves out. Now, of course, a lot of the features that they referenced are still not here yet, but as the releases roll out this year, more and more of those Apple Intelligence features will come. But with those Apple Intelligence features finally coming, that means the private cloud compute platform is finally getting, put into action, if you will. So Apple is really putting their money where their mouth is at this point, because originally they made that claim, asking any security researcher or privacy researcher or anyone that was interested to perform their own independent investigation and verification of their claims. But as I said, they are now putting their money where their mouth is, quite literally, in fact. So first off, they have open sourced some of the main kind of driver code behind the private cloud compute on their GitHub. And essentially what this allows you to do is to run a virtual instance of the private cloud compute platform on your local Mac in order to test around with it and play around with it in order to verify Apple's claims, right? Basically, here's the code that runs the private cloud compute platform. Try to break it, try to find instances where data is being leaked or not being secure or whatever, and really just letting everyone have at it. So according to Apple, this virtual research environment, as they're calling it, basically taps into the Mac's virtual secure enclave processor and leverages the built-in macOS support of virtualization and graphics and whatnot to enable this private cloud compute kind of on your local machine. So the bounties for this, because this is where they're actually putting their money where their mouth is, they're putting up bounties for the private cloud compute platform. Specifically, there's a couple different ranges here of how much you can get paid for it, ranging from anywhere from $50,000 to up to $1 million. So this range kind of comes from either accidental or unexpected data disclosure due to deployment or configuration issue. If you find a verified instance of that, you can get $50,000. And then there's a kind of like I said, a range of things. But if you can get arbitrary code execution with arbitrary entitlements, so essentially you can, of course, get code to execute on the platform that wasn't intended to be with some kind of privileges, that's where you can get $1 million in payouts. So Apple is really putting their money where their mouth is here and really wanting people to break it. So they probably are feeling pretty confident about it. And this is the kind of thing, in my mind, of course, I'm probably going to sound like an Apple sheep right here for even saying this, but this is the kind of data privacy thing that I think, quite honestly, all big tech companies that are worth their salt and believe in anything privacy related should be striving for and should be, pushing for. Because as someone that is a champion of open source software, I mean, personally, I love open source software. I try to use open source software wherever possible, which of course makes me sound like a complete hypocrite because I have openly stated that my primary operating system of choice is Mac OS, which of course is proprietary and not open source. So of course me saying that I am a champion of open source is kind of hypocritical. Totally understand that. But for most of my things, like my go-to text editor of choice for writing code and stuff is VS Codium, which is basically VS Code, which is a Microsoft product with all the Microsoft telemetry garbage stripped out of it, and basically trying to use open source tools wherever I can. Of course, my hypervisor of choice is Proxmox, which is based on Linux, completely open source. Pretty much all of the servers that run in my home lab are Linux-based, so a lot of open source technology that I like to run But one of the reasons why people like open source so much is because the source code is all there for anyone to see. Now, of course, this has its pros and cons. One of the notable pros, of course, is that anyone can look at the source code, meaning that if if a given open source project is trying to do something funky, like steal your data, people can see that, and they can either do one of two things. Well, probably more than two things, but two things as an example. One, they can push a change to remove that data harvesting, or they can end up forking the repository and creating their own version that removes all of that data harvesting. Usually, I think the latter option is kind of what occurs, but kind of the one of the reasons that open source is has such a high reputation amongst the open source community is the fact that it's generally very privacy respective, again, because anyone can look at the source code, and if they, figure out that it's actually harvesting your data, they're probably going to create their own instance of it and remove all of that. So Apple here essentially encouraging everyone to find instances to prove their claim false, that they basically trying to find any instance that there is exposure of data possible and all this stuff. To do that is definitely something that I think kind of hammers home, if you will, that while Apple is still very much a proprietary company when it comes to their software, I mean, look at macOS, iOS, and all their operating systems, closed source for sure, but if they're willing to do something like this, I think it definitely adds credibility to the fact that they are a very privacy-focused company. Now, are they perfect? No, nobody's perfect. No company is perfect when it comes to, user privacy and all that. But it definitely adds a more, what am I trying to say here? It strengthens their credibility level when they claim and, say that, their products and their software is privacy focused and they're not trying to sell your user data, compared to when someone like a Google or a Microsoft or someone like that tries to make claims about user privacy when they're also actively harvesting user data. So kind of like that. So that was a very long and rambly talk about Apple's, trying to put their money where their mouth is with this private cloud compute. But I think that is very cool to see, and I'm very interested to see if anyone actually is able to come up with and cash in on one of those bounties, because regardless of which level you get in, like I said, it ranges from 50,000 to $1 million. I mean, that's a pretty solid payday if you ask me. So any of you security researchers, privacy researchers, or just interested, that's definitely something that maybe you could work on as maybe a side project if you think you can crack it. So with that bit of security news out of the way, let's get into this week's cybersecurity tip. So this week's cybersecurity tip is to make use of cold storage. Now, I'm not saying you should, not talking about like your freezer or your refrigerator or anything like that. I'm talking about hot versus cold storage, or this idea of active and live storage that you can access immediately versus cold storage that is offline and inaccessible. So as a kind of a quick, that was basically the TLDR of hot versus cold storage, but to get in a little more detail, hot storage is essentially storage that, kind of like I mentioned, is always available. So you can think of this as like a network attached storage solution, or a NAS, any kind of file server, or any type of storage device that is available to you that you can actively pull data from or write data to. Like think of an external drive, for instance, that's currently plugged in to your computer that you can easily read and write data from. That would be considered hot storage. Now, Cold storage is essentially the opposite of that. It's offline and unable to be written to. Now, of course, obviously, in order to create cold storage, you have to have hot storage, if you will, in order for it to be able to be read to or written to and read from, in order to put data on your storage in order to make it cold storage. But the idea here is that you keep it offline unless you are actively updating it or reading data off of it. And the reason why it's so important to have cold storage as well as, your regular hot storage, if you will, is the idea to, back up data, because having hot storage is obviously a huge benefit. Being able to having readily available backups and access to storage like your network attached storage, for instance, is fantastic and a great solution to quickly restore data over the network were something to happen. But this convenience, of course, comes at a security cost, because generally speaking, the more convenient something is, the less secure it is, because file servers and NAS devices are prime targets for threat actors when they infiltrate a network and are looking to deploy ransomware. Because if they can find a file server or some kind of NAS or network attached storage device on the network, that is a prime target to infect with ransomware, because the chance of that potentially being more valuable and thus a higher likelihood of them getting a payout is greater than if they were just to randomly ransomware some generic device or server on the network. So this is, again, where the 3-2-1 backup strategy comes in. Now, we've talked about this before, the 3-2-1 backup strategy, of course, being 3 copies of the data on 2 different storage mediums, and one of those being off-site. Now, having cold storage is a great option to incorporate into your backup strategy, but of course, like everything in cybersecurity, it is no silver bullet. Because if you remember, the only kind of device that is safe from threat actors is the device that is completely powered off and unplugged. Because if you have any device that is powered on, or even if it's plugged in or anything like that, it is potentially susceptible to attacks, right? Because there's still a chance that it could be attacked, but if it's completely unplugged, completely offline, there's no way for a threat actor to remotely access it, right? So now, of course, this also assumes that your cold storage is in a secure location, because if your cold storage is, say, on a flash drive that you just leave lying around, like in, at Starbucks or the local library or some other place, you just leave it lying around, of course your data is not secure, right? But assuming you're keeping it, keeping track of your cold storage and keeping it in a at least semi-secure location, it ensures that in the event that, say, your main file server gets compromised, you have a more direct access to that data that you can much more readily restore from, rather than, say, having to pull down from a cloud backup, for instance. Now, of course, this again assumes that you're at least semi-regularly updating your cold storage to keep it in line with your hot storage. But regardless, even if the last time you updated your cold storage was, say, a couple months ago, depending on what you're storing on your cold storage, you're not necessarily completely out of luck. Now, like I said, depending on what you're storing on there, what the data on there might be too old and outdated and won't do you any good. Like if you're, say, storing, cryptographic keys, for instance, if those happen to expire, like if you're putting on like API tokens or something like that and those have expired, then of course it's not going to do you any good. But if it's, say, a copy of your resume or a book you're working on or something like that, you might not have the latest up-to-date version, but at least you have a version of it, so you're not, completely starting from scratch. But of course, here, as we're kind of alluding here, is the main drawback to using cold storage, and that, of course, being you can't automate it. And if you know me, I love automating as much as I can. So this, of course, is a major drawback because unlike computers and servers that you can either run specific software to ensure they're getting backed up on a regular basis or running scripts to automatically back them up for you, you have to actually remember to plug in your cold storage to, again, make it hot storage and update it with whatever data needs to be updated. So there's, of course, a much more manual process involved here in order to keep your cold storage updated. Now, that's not to say you can't write some kind of script or automation to update your cold storage once you actually plug it in, but there of course still is the manual process of you actually having to plug it in order for you to run whatever your automation script is, assuming that you have one. But again, like everything in cybersecurity, a cold storage solution is just like Swiss cheese. You know, nothing in cybersecurity is foolproof, and everything has its drawbacks to some degree, and there are no silver bullets, because if there were silver bullets, we'd all be using those. But remember, the goal here is to add as many layers as you can, so even in the event that one of them fails, there are others that can then pick up the slack and try to block the threat. So again, this is kind of one of the reasons for the 3-2-1 backup strategy, right? Even in the event that you lose one of your 3 copies, you still have 2 others. Even in the event that your 2 on-site backups get destroyed somehow, like you had some natural disaster come through or something and destroyed those, you have your off-site backup that you can restore from. If both your off-site backup and your local backup have spinning hard drives and both of the hard drives fail, if your 3rd copy is on a flash drive and that's still good, you still have access to the data. Now, of course, there's the option that all 3 of them fail, but again, the idea here is the Swiss cheese method that hopefully, you have enough, those holes are overlapping enough to the point that you're, protected and safe. But of course, nothing is foolproof. But again, that's kind of the idea behind the Swiss cheese method, is that while nothing is foolproof, if you layer enough layers on top of each other, your security overall improves. So depending on, what your offsite backup solution is too, we kind of touched on this, it could take some time in order for you to, restore from that backup in the event that, say, a threat actor breaks into your network and ransomwares your NAS, or you otherwise suffer a critical failure. If you have some of that critical information on, say, like a cold storage flash drive or something, you can much more quickly recover from that incident rather than having to rely on waiting for potentially an offsite backup to come in. Because depending on what your offsite backup solution is, that could take a significant amount of time depending on what your internet connection is like, and depending on, like I said, what your offsite backup solution is. Because, for instance, if you use something like the AWS Glacier solution, which is a cloud storage offering by AWS or Amazon, one of the benefits to that is you can get a lot of storage for pretty cheap. But the issue is, if you ever want to retrieve that data, it kind of takes a while in order for them to pull it out of that, Glacier storage and get it back to you. So again, depending on what your solution for offsite backup is, might be potentially an issue. Or if your offsite backup is a cold storage solution, like you run external hard drives like to a friend's house or something, or your parents' house that are out of state, or whatever the case is, and every time you visit, you bring an updated copy and take the old one back with you. Even like best case there, you got to ship the drive to yourself, like from your relative's house or whatever. So in any case, depending on what your offsite backup solution is, having a local copy on cold storage could be a much quicker solution to get back up at least some of your critical infrastructure backed up and running. So that is your cybersecurity tip for the week. And moving right along, let's get into what nerdy stuff have I been up to this week. So I got back to, again, writing some more code for the video game I'm working on, and So I had items, right? So that's kind of the big thing that I've been working on the past couple weeks in conjunction with the bag menu, kind of the inventory and kind of laying all that user interface out. And this week I kind of laid the groundwork for setting like characteristics of an item. So if you've played Pokemon before, of course there are some items that you can use, some items that you can give, but there are also items that you can't use at all. They're just literally just an item that you can sell or give, but you can't use them. So having like specific characteristics was something that I wanted to get added in, and I at least got the groundwork for it. And as I kind of started to implement this a little bit, I realized it's a lot more nuanced than just a single bit flag to determine if you can use an item, because of course how you use an item is dependent on kind of the environment and use case that you're in, right? So for instance, an evolutionary stone, for instance, can be used, but it can only be used either on a specific Pokemon, which quite honestly is pretty easy to check for, but it also depends on your use case, right? Like if you're in the middle of a battle, you can't use an evolutionary item. That's not how it works. So having some type of checks to determine if the conditions are right for the item to be usable, I haven't fully fleshed that out yet, so that's something that I still have to determine. I'm not sure if those are like additional, more niche use flags that I want to add to the item characteristic itself, or if I just want to always do some kind of check after I determine if the item is usable or not in order to see if you can actually use it. So a little bit more work that'll have to be done there, but at least the groundwork for that has been laid in order to set that up. The other thing I got working is I added some animations. Now, of course, graphics are not my strong suit, and as I've kind of got into implementing more of the graphics portion of the game, specifically these menus, they tend to take a little bit longer than I might like. And part of that, of course, has to do with the fact that I essentially am hard coding everything. Not in the sense that I'm using a bunch of magic numbers, but in the sense that there is no graphics engine because I'm doing this all from scratch. Why? Because I want to. That's pretty much the only reason. But because I'm doing it all from scratch, I can't just easily drag and drop and place things exactly where I want them on the screen. There's a lot of trial and error of testing things out, making sure it's kind of aligned where I want it to be. So it is a very manual process. Now, now that I've said that, and it's honestly something I've thought about, is maybe I should write like my own game engine in a sense, or some kind of editor to make this process go a lot quicker. It's something I thought of, but at the same time, that would be its own fairly large-scale development effort, so that's one of the reasons why I've kind of strayed away from it. But in any case, I got some animations working. So I touched on probably a couple weeks ago at this point, adding the various navigation arrows to both the bag menu itself, so kind of showing you that you can either go left or right to go through each of the different pockets in the bag, or depending on how many items you currently have in the current pocket you're in, indicating that you can either scroll up or down. Now, up until this point, those arrows were just static. They didn't move at all. And of course, if you've played one of the Gen 3 Pokemon games, specifically the Hoenn region games, you know that those arrows actually animate and kind of have this sort of breathing effect, if you will, where they kind of move in and out or up and down respectively. And it just gives the overall environment and vibe, much more, it makes it much more lively, having like those elements moving. So that was one thing I wanted to tackle this week, and I did finally end up getting it working. I think there's something I kind of want to look into a little bit more, because when I was first trying to implement this, for whatever reason, the kind of that breathing effect would get out of sync rather quickly and stay out of sync, and it just looked horrible. But then if I put a certain ratio between kind of the offsets of how far the arrows can move from their center point and the amount they move like each frame. If I put that ratio like just right, they would always stay in sync. But if I deviated a little bit, they would get out of sync, which to me kind of didn't make sense, just because I was giving each arrow group. So, for instance, the arrows that indicate which pocket you're in, I was giving the range that they had to go between was the same, and the amount that they would change per frame was also the same. So in theory, they should always, be in sync with one another regardless of how much that increment is. At least that was my understanding, my interpretation. Maybe I'm just dumb and an idiot and I don't know how graphics work, which is totally true. I don't really understand graphics that well, which is why it usually takes me a long time to implement them because, like I said, not my strong suit. But I was under the assumption that they would move in sync, but for whatever reason, one would always seem to be like one frame before the other one. So like the left arrow would only count like 4 frames before it started going back to the middle, where the one on the right would go like 5 frames and then go back to the middle. And then of course you do repeat that process over and over again, and you can quickly see how they get out of sync pretty quickly. So not entirely sure what was going on there, so I think that is something I want to investigate a little further. But at least the current solution that I have now, which isn't a complete hack job because I'm not hard coding the values per se, I'm just kind of doing some math trickery to always ensure that I have the right value that will ensure they stay in sync. But I do kind of want to try to, like I said, investigate that a little bit more to see if I can't, figure out another solution, or if this only kind of one sweet spot is what I'm working with. But so that's what I got up to this week. Now let's actually get into the thing that Apple did that you were actually thinking of, and the tragedy and the millions of wallets that suddenly cried out in terror, and that disturbance in the force that I felt. So Apple, as they kind of mentioned, I don't know if they mentioned in a press release or what, but they mentioned that this week they were going to be announcing some new Macs. And I think myself and a lot of people that have already done coverage of their Mac releases were kind of scratching our heads as to why this wasn't some kind of keynote style event, because they had 3 different essentially keynote style videos for each one of the releases. Now, granted, they were only like 10 to 15 minutes. I think they were maybe like 12 or something. So it would have been a fairly short event. But if you combine that up with the iPad mini that they released like a couple weeks ago, you add a little keynote event to the iPad mini thing, and I mean, you probably could make a keynote event out of it. So I'm not entirely sure why they didn't do that. But regardless, of course, they had to talk about Apple Intelligence quite a lot, actually. I mean, I don't blame them, since that's like their big new thing. But quite honestly, it kind of got a little old after a while, because they kept bringing it up. It's like, yes, we know it's this groundbreaking thing and yada yada yada, but can I just see the products now? So of course the big things that they announced were new Macs, but they also announced new accessories as well. Well, not really new accessories. They're the same as the ones that already exist. They just now have USB-C. So if you want to, of course, use the Magic Mouse, you still got to turn it upside down to charge it. But it is USB-C now. So moving into the Macs that they announced, the first one they announced, which was on Monday, was the iMac. So the iMac got some slightly different colors. I think kind of the shade or the pastel level or something is different. I'm not the best guy to talk about colors with, but they do have slightly different colors. It also gets the center stage camera. So if you're unaware, this is essentially that idea from, I think, the iPads. The iPads have it. And it's basically the camera will essentially follow you around the frame, so essentially always keeping you in the middle of the frame. Or if you're trying to, reference an object or something, it'll keep kind of the object in frame. And it also gives the desk view feature as well. So because it's like kind of an ultra wide camera, it can also, in addition to looking just at your face, it can also look straight down at your desk to kind of show, what's on your desk. So that's, I guess, pretty cool as well. It gets the M4 chip. Now, there's two different versions that you can get. You can get the binned version, which has 8 CPU cores and 8 GPU cores, or you can get the full fat M4 chip, which has 10 CPU and GPU cores. And here is probably the best part, well, maybe not the best, but one of the best parts about the entire keynote release, whatever, is the M4 chip. And on all of the Macs, so all the Macs that they announced now start with 16 gigabytes of RAM. And of course, this is significant because now 16 gigs of RAM will be the base from now on, which, if you ask me, and probably most people, it's kind of about time. But as a side note of this, they also retroactively updated the entire MacBook Air lineup. So all MacBook Air models now also start with 16 gigs of RAM minimum. So even the $999 M2 13-inch MacBook Air now starts with 16 gigs of RAM, which quite honestly is fantastic because, in my opinion, one of the biggest downsides of trying to go for a MacBook Air is by the time you'd, at least in my opinion, configure it to the point of it being usable, i.e. not having 8 gigs of RAM, the price kind of starts creeping up a little bit, and then you fall into the Apple ladder strategy, which if you haven't heard of what the Apple ladder strategy is, they essentially kind of, tier their products in such a way where if you want to add like a couple upgrades, you get to the point where I'm only like $100 less than the more upgraded one, so I'll just upgrade to it and essentially try to get you keep going up and up the ladder until you spend a lot more money than you want to. Yeah. But also, now that I, heard, after hearing all of this with the 16 gigs of RAM and that virtual research environment, I was wondering if this has anything to do with that, because one of the requirements of the virtual research environment for their private cloud compute testing range, essentially for you to test it out, the private cloud compute range to test their claims, the requirements were macOS Sonoma 15.1 or newer and an Apple Silicon Mac with at least 16 gigs of RAM. So I don't know if they're correlated at all, but that would be kind of cool if maybe it's just an unneeded excuse for why they upgraded to 16 gigs of RAM, that anyone buying a new Mac could now go and test, with the virtual research environment to test the private cloud compute. Just something I thought of. Probably not, but honestly, even if that was Apple's sole reasoning for giving all Macs 16 gigs of RAM, I'm honestly not going to complain because I think it's about time that they started with at least 16 gigs of RAM. But also, if you get to the non-binned version, so the 512 gigs of storage version, so if you get that one, for some reason you can also get 32 gigs of RAM, which is cool, but only if you get the non-binned version. If you get the binned version, you, I think, can only get up to like 24 gigs. But also what's nice to see is the non-bin version now comes with 4 Thunderbolt 4 ports. So Whereas before on the previous iMacs, if you got the full-fat M series chip, whether that was the M1 or the M2, you would get 2 Thunderbolt ports and then 2 additional USB-C ports, but they weren't all Thunderbolt. But this time, if you get the full-fat M4 chip, you get 4 Thunderbolt ports, which is pretty cool to see. Storage still starts at 256 gigs, which is a little on the slim side, but I mean, I guess we gotta count our blessings where we can get them. They upgraded the storage to 16 gigs and basically kept the price the same, so I mean, I guess there's that. Kind of as we talked about before, giving you like the better value for the money, right? Because if you got the M2 iMac with the base with 512 gigs of storage and 16 gigs of RAM, you would essentially be paying $200 more because Apple likes to charge way too much for RAM upgrades, but that's neither here nor there. But the base price is still for the base model rather is still the same price at $1299. You can pre-order for all of the Macs, you can pre-order them now, and the first shipments will be arriving on November 8th. Depending on how you customize it, those dates might be pushed back a little bit further, but for some of the more basic models, kind of the more generic configurations, you'll probably be more likely to get those on November 8th, unless dates have already started to slip. I'm not sure. I haven't checked the past day or two. But next we get into probably the one I was most excited for, and I think a lot of people were very excited for, which was the Mac Mini. So the Mac Mini was redesigned to a much smaller footprint. And the reason why this is kind of significant is because ever since Apple Silicon came to the Mac Minis, if you ever took one of them apart and kind of looked inside, what you would see is basically the entire thing is just empty, and then this tiny little logic board in the back. And there was just tons and tons of empty space. So I think Quinn from Snazzy Labs even did a video a couple years ago, I think when the M1 Mac Mini came out, essentially putting it into a smaller case and making it a real mini computer. So that's essentially what Apple did here. So they redesigned it to, it's now 5x5 and 2 inches tall. To be honest, the only downside about this is now that it's ever so slightly taller, since with it being 2 inches now, it doesn't fit in 1U of rack space anymore, which probably doesn't matter to 99.999% of people, but I just thought I'd throw that out there. But even still, this doesn't matter to people that rack mount Mac Minis, because if you saw in the video that they talked about the Mac Mini, of it being able to use in server farms, or if you've ever tried to rack mount mini PCs, the more optimal way to rack mount them is to essentially stand them up on their side and stack them all essentially vertically, so their thin sides are kind of closer together, and that way you can pack a lot more in more densely. So that way you can essentially cram somewhere between 15-ish Mac Minis, at least on the previous gen ones, and about 5U of space, which is better than if you would try to stack them, within 1U of rack space. Since if you tried to stack them within 1U of rack space, you could essentially only get 2 in one rack unit, essentially. So within the same 5 rack units, you could only get 10 compared to the 15-ish or so. That number might not be quite accurate. It might be 12 or something like that, but it's more than what you could get otherwise. So again, even for those that are trying to rack mount the Mac Mini, there we go. I don't think this is really that huge of a deal, but just thought I'd mention it. So as far as the ports configuration is concerned, the Mac Mini does change the port configuration. There's no more USB-A ports, but it still comes with Ethernet, and it can be configured with the 10 gig NIC, which is very nice to see. It also comes with HDMI and 3 Thunderbolt ports on the back, as well as 2 USB-C ports and an audio jack on the front. So kind of similar to the Mac Studio design. And the other thing that was also rather interesting about it was the power button is on the bottom of the device now. I guess there wasn't enough room on the back, maybe? I don't know. But also, the other thing to note, too, is the back is now, like, all aluminum, whereas before on the previous generation Mac Mini, it was kind of like a built-in I/O shield, so I guess maybe with the whole back being aluminum, it was not as easy to fit a power button there. Not entirely sure. But what's really interesting is those Thunderbolt ports. The keen-eared among you might have noticed I didn't say what kind of Thunderbolt ports they were, because depending on what chip you get in the Mac Mini, you get a different type of Thunderbolt port. So if you get the base Mac Mini with the M4, you get 3 Thunderbolt 4 ports. But if you get the Mac Mini with the M4 Pro chip, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, you get Thunderbolt 5 ports, so 3 Thunderbolt 5 ports. Now, I'm kind of ashamed to even admit this, but I'm going to be honest with you guys. I didn't even know that Thunderbolt 5 was even out yet until I saw the video of Apple announcing the Mac Mini. So how badly does that display on me? I'm not sure. I think I did look it up afterwards. I think Thunderbolt 5 came out last year in 2023. So in my defense, it hasn't been out for too long, but also, like, I tried to look up, like, external, like, enclosures for, like, NVMe SSDs for Thunderbolt 5, like, on Amazon, and found absolutely nothing. It was all still Thunderbolt 4. So there are definitely not many Thunderbolt 5 devices out there, but the nice thing is, if you do end up upgrading to the M4 Pro chip, and it also, spoiler, Thunderbolt 5 ports also come on the MacBook Pros with either an M4 Pro or M4 Max chip. The nice thing about that is you kind of future-proof yourself. Whenever Thunderbolt 5 does become more mainstream, you have that on your Mac and you can plug in those faster devices. Now, with Thunderbolt 5, you get transfer speeds of up to 120 gigabits per second. So compared to Thunderbolt 3 and Thunderbolt 4, those only had 40 gigabits per second. So quite the speed increase. Now, as for the other USB-C ports, the two on the front, those are just standard USB 3 and operate at 10 gigabits per second, and those are the same across all models. So getting into the M4 chip real quick, the M4 chip, there's no binning at all. You get the 10-core CPU, GPU as the standard one. Now, I'm probably going to sound like an Apple shill here for this next thing I'm going to say, but can we appreciate the fact that in the part where they're talking about the M4 chip, they mentioned a 13 times faster speed improvement than the fastest Intel Mac Mini? Now, there's two camps on this when Apple refers to their chips and older or their current chip that they're releasing versus older ones. Now, for me personally, yeah, I can see. So first off, I guess I'll say I see both sides of this, because it's kind of a cheap shot from Apple's perspective to essentially say, like, yeah, look, we're blowing Intel out of the water like we have been for the past 4 years with Apple Silicon, and look how badly we're beating it. Like, yeah, that's kind of what we're expecting of you at this point. But on the flip side, as someone that is still dailying a 2012 Mac Mini, this helps me kind of put into context and contextualize what kind of a performance improvement I can expect if I were to upgrade to one of these new Mac Minis. And if you think I'm joking when I say if, that's probably a good assumption, because I think it's probably a safer question of when rather than if. But for the time being, it's still an if, although that is probably not going to be for much longer. But again, we're getting way off track here. So remember the discussions we've had before about context matters? Like, literally last week we talked about being a subject matter expert, but the key of the key of being a subject matter expert was what context are you referring to? Remember, we gave that example of, a first grader or an elementary schooler that's learning their multiplication tables is a subject matter expert in math compared to preschoolers. but are they really a subject matter expert in math? Probably not. So again, it kind of comes down to what your point of reference is. So kind of as a sidebar here, kind of go on this little tangent before we bring this back around. Again, I'm probably going to sound like an apple sheep when I say this, and I'm just slurping down the apple Kool-Aid. But I understand why Apple compares their latest stuff to generations old stuff, right? Because, yeah, it looks bad in the sense that you're only doing it, you're not doing a year-over-year comparison. So by comparing to older stuff, you can kind of bolster and artificially inflate how good your new thing is, which I totally agree with, and it makes sense. But again, your average consumer that's going to be upgrading to your new thing doesn't understand what that performance difference means, right? Like, to them, saying your new chip is 10% faster than last year's, or it's 15% faster than last year's, for them, that's not going to mean anything because they don't have last year's chip. They don't have any source of, reference of what that actually means. But if you say it's, 1.7 times faster than 2 years old chip, or it's twice as fast as the M1, you're more likely to encounter people with an M1 that may be thinking about upgrading, probably not, but maybe be thinking about upgrading, and then they see that, oh, hey, this new chip is twice as fast as the one that's in my current computer, and my current computer is still pretty fast, so wow, that's a really big speed improvement. Or, you got people like me on Intel Mac Minis still, and you hear the number of 13 times faster than the fastest Intel Mac Mini. And for me, I'm thinking, okay, so my Mac Mini isn't the fastest Intel Mac Mini, and the fastest one is a decent amount faster than mine, so that's a really big increase. So I can have that, that point of context to reference from. So again, for me personally, it kind of comes down to, what are you comparing to, right? Comparison to what? What is your point of reference? So personally for me, while I get that it's kind of a cop-out and a cheap shot that Apple likes to compare their latest and greatest chip to chips that are a couple years old, I do appreciate the fact that they are comparing it to older stuff to give those normal users kind of a little bit more point of reference into just how good of a chip that this is. So getting back on track here, let's get into the M4 Pro chip. And Apple is claiming that it's the world's fastest CPU core, of course, that just being for single-threaded performance. Now, I'm assuming this is probably due to a clock speed thing. I would assume the actual core architecture between the M4 Pro and the M4 is the same. I would just assume that the M4 is clocked higher, essentially that meaning that I can perform more operations per second, and therefore making it faster. So there's, of course, two different variants. You have the kind of the binned version, which has a 12-core CPU, and the full version has a 14-core CPU. In the 14-core version, you get 10 performance cores and 4 efficiency cores. This is honestly really nice to see because last year in the M3 Pro, they kind of did a weird half-and-half thing between the performance and efficiency cores and really didn't net you much performance gain compared to the M2 Pro. I think it was pretty much kind of a draw for the most part and what I saw for like benchmarks. Now, of course, you would get, better battery life because you had more efficiency cores and you were essentially getting the same performance for less power drawn away. But it is nice to see that they're actually adding more performance cores here with that 10-to-4 ratio. As for the GPU, the 20-core GPU is I think the standard, and Apple is claiming 2 times the performance of the M4, which, I mean, I would kind of expect. You double the amount of GPU cores, I would kind of expect about twice the performance. And they're also claiming a 75% increase in memory bandwidth compared to the M3 Pro. Now, I need to make a caveat here and kind of interject because their marketing about it being a 75% increase based on the M3 Pro is a little bit deceptive. And the reason I say that is because the M3 Pro's memory bandwidth was actually a downgrade compared to the M2 Pro. So yes, you are getting a increased memory bandwidth, and it also is indeed faster than the M2 Pro, but the idea of it being a 75% increase compared to the M3 is a little deceptive because the M3 was lower than the M2, at least in regards to memory bandwidth for the M2 Pros, I mean. So a little bit of a deceptive thing there, but again, for Apple's marketing terms, it looks better to compare it to the weaker one than the better one, right? So understand why they did it, but that is just kind of something that kind of jumped out to me right away when they compared the memory bandwidth to the slower of the M series Pro line anyway. Now again, like all M4 chips, starts with 16 gigs of RAM as well for the Mac Mini with the M4 chip, and you can get up to 64 gigs of RAM with the M4 Pro. If you get the M4 Pro, though, that starts with 24 gigs, so pretty nice to see. And you also get 512 gigs of storage as well, so you kind of get a bump to both the RAM and the storage, which is in addition to the improved chip as well. And the starting storage, kind of as I touched on, is still 256 gigs with the option to go up to 8 terabytes, assuming you get the M4 Pro. If you just stick with the M4, you can go up to 2 terabytes. And the price still starts at $599. So you're getting the increased 16 gigs of storage, or not storage, 16 gigs of RAM, and the chip improvement all for the same price. And kind of as I mentioned, you can pre-order now, and first shipments will start arriving on November 8th. Now, I touched on a little bit when going through the Mac Mini that it was probably more of a question of when I upgrade to it rather than if. And let me tell you, it took a fair bit of restraint from my more responsible half to not immediately pre-order a loaded M4 Pro Mac Mini when I first saw it. Because let me tell you, when I first saw that keynote, I also had a friend that was texting me too, like, "Oh, did you see the new Mac Mini? You gonna get one?" And I was like, "Man, let me tell you, we had a good conversation back and forth, and we were both kind of on the edge of like, I'm specking one out right now, and like I'm really close to pre-ordering one. I actually had one in the bag at one point, but my more responsible half was able to pump the brakes hard enough in order to restrain myself from buying one, because I decided that I needed to wait to see the real-world performance comparisons in order to make a more informed decision. Now, is that going to change the fact that I'm probably still going to end up loading up a Mac Mini and buying it? Probably not, no. But I needed at least a better justification to myself, and I can at least tell myself that I, quote, did my research. Because honestly, my only, I guess, real gripe with the Mac Mini is the redesign is, honestly, I'm not a huge fan of the ports on the front. Now, I know some people love it, but to me, that is coming from the older design. There's something about the clean aesthetic of the front that I just like. Now, yeah, is it annoying that anytime I want to plug something in, I have to reach around the back of the computer to do it? Yeah, it's annoying, but it also looks cool. But again, that's a super nitpick thing. But yeah, don't be surprised if you hear in a future episode about me purchasing a new Mac. But anyway, let's get into the MacBook Pros before we wrap this episode up. So the MacBook Pros come with an option of the M4, M4 Pro, or M4 Max chip. The M4 Max is the one we haven't talked about yet. So the M4 Max, the binned version, is 14 cores for the CPU and 16 cores if you get the full version. That full version is 12 performance and 4 efficiency. What will be honestly really interesting to see is if the binned M4 Max performs the same as the full-fat M4 Pro, because both of them are equipped with a 14-core CPU and 10 performance cores and 4 efficiency cores. So I would assume their performance would be more or less lockstep with one another. The only potential reason I see the M4 Max possibly eking out a slight performance increase would be if the M4 Max was clocked slightly higher. But to be honest, with the price increase that would come with upgrading to the M4 Max, the binned version, I don't know if it would be worth that upgrade for maybe the negligible to maybe a couple percentage points increase in the M4 Max versus a higher end M4 Pro. Again, not sure. We'll have to wait till we get the real-world results from performance benchmarks and real-world testing, but that's kind of something I've been wondering about since the binned version of the M4 Max and the full version of the M4 Pro both have the same layout in terms of performance and efficiency cores. So moving on to the GPU, the binned version of the M4 Max comes with 32 GPU cores, and the full-fat version comes with 40. So in addition to the new chips, the new MacBook Pros also have improved battery life as well. So depending on your various configuration and what you're doing, Apple is claiming between like a 1 and 4 hours increase in battery life, again, depending on what you're doing and what chip you have. They also, I think, commented that it's like the first Mac with like a 24-hour battery life. So, of course, that being very heavily dependent on what you're actually doing and the chip you have. But it is, regardless, nice to see that there is some battery improvements there. Webcams, like the iMac, also get the center stage feature. One thing that I'm not 100% sure the usefulness of is kind of the desk view with the MacBook Pro, because unless you have some kind of stand that you can prop your Mac on to kind of give it more of an angled look to kind of use as like so I'm doing a horrible job of explaining this, but I know there are stands out there where you essentially put your Mac on and kind of tilt the screen back like a lot to essentially kind of have it in line with an external display and kind of have it, like kind of like a docked mode, but also you still want to use the MacBook in kind of a more eye level line of sight and also use like an external keyboard and mouse kind of a thing. But regardless, unless you have it in kind of that style, I'm not sure how useful the top-down view would be because you would basically just see the keyboard. Not sure how useful that would be. I mean, I guess if you wanted to like kind of show something above the keyboard, I mean, there'd still be usefulness, but in, I think, a decent amount of scenarios, if you just have it like sitting flat on a desk, you're just going to see the keyboard. So again, not entirely sure how useful that will be, but I'm sure there's definitely still use cases for that. Now, all of the models get 3 Thunderbolt ports. So unlike the M3 MacBook Pro that came out last year that only had 2 Thunderbolt ports, all MacBook Pros this year get 3 Thunderbolt ports rather than the lowest one only getting 2. So now again, like the Mac Mini, it depends on what chip you get as to what kind of Thunderbolt port you get. If you get the base MacBook Pro with the M4, you get Thunderbolt 4 ports. And then, of course, if you get, kind of as I touched on, if you get the M4 Pro or the M4 Max, you get Thunderbolt 5 ports. Now, unlike the Mac Mini with the M4 Pro, the MacBook Pros, if you want 64 gigs of RAM, you have to get the maxed out M4 Max, which is honestly quite weird because on the Mac Mini, you can get 64 gigs of RAM with the M4 Pro. So not sure what's up with that. But what's even weirder is if you get the binned version of the M4 Max, you are only able to get 36 gigs of RAM. Now, of course, I say only 36 gigs, there we go, of RAM is still a lot of RAM, but you can only get that. You can't upgrade the RAM at all unless you upgrade the chip, which to me is kind of weird. The other thing that makes this even weirder, so we're at like a second or third stage of weird at this point, is if you get the M4 Pro, you can at least upgrade that to 48 gigs of RAM. Now, you can't get 64 for some reason, even though you can on the Mac Mini, so not sure what that's all about. But it's kind of weird that you can get more RAM on the M4 Pro than you can on the base M4 Max. Not sure what the reasoning for that is, aside from Apple wanting more money. But yeah, not sure what the reasoning for that is. Now, I think like last year, the 128 gigs is still the same for the Mac. So if you max out your MacBook Pro with the full fat M4 Max, you can get 128 gigs of RAM if you want to shell out the big bucks for it. Now, the other kind of cool thing about the M4 Max is the memory bandwidth is just over half a terabit per second. So really, really fast. Even faster than the M4 Pro. So that will, not sure how much you would necessarily notice that per se, but super fast, and that's of course never going to be a downside when it comes to memory bandwidth. Now, speaking of rather peculiar config options, unlike the Mac Mini, where you could get 8 terabytes of storage with the M4 Pro, for some reason, if you want 8 terabytes of storage on the MacBook Pro, you have to shell out for the full, well, actually, I'm not sure if it's the full, but you have to shell out for the M4 Max. You can't get 8 terabytes of storage with the M4 Pro. If you want to get the M4 Pro, the most you can get is 4 terabytes. Not sure why this is a thing when, like I said, on the Mac Mini, you can get 8 terabytes, but regardless, kind of a lot of weird stuff with the MacBook Pro config options, but like the Mac Mini and the iMac, you can pre-order them now with the first shipments arriving on November 8th. So yeah, those are the new Macs. I'd be interested to hear if any of you guys are interested in potentially upgrading, especially if you're still on Intel like me. I think the M4 generation, there's definitely a lot of good here. It's a more refined version of the 3nm process compared to the M3. The M4 Pro actually seems like an upgrade year over year compared to the M3 Pro. So I think these are going to be some really good devices. I'm also very interested to see what the reviews come out with, what the performance is like for all these chips and how they compare with the previous gen. Based on some of the kind of guesstimates that people have been putting out, it's looking pretty good, but of course we'll have to see when the real results come in. And of course, kind of as I have been touching on, I am very excited to justify myself spending money on upgrading my Mac Mini, because I'm honestly, like I said, had one in the bag and was ready to go before my more responsible self told me no. But I'm sure a lot of people, their wallets were not so lucky to have a responsible half save them, and cried out in terror as thousands of dollars left them. But that was this week's episode with the new Mac lineup. Again, I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts are on that, or what your thoughts are on Apple's putting their money where their mouth is with their private cloud compute platform. But before we go, let's get back to our trivia question for the week. So PDFs are ubiquitous in today's digital world, but what does PDF actually stand for? If you said portable document format, congratulations, you got this week's trivia question correct. And yeah, so if you enjoyed this episode, definitely be sure to leave it a rating and review, and subscribe if you haven't done so already. And be sure to share it around with friends or family members. And if you have any questions or comments or ideas for future episodes, or anything about this episode, shoot me an email at contact@darkassassinsinc.com, or you can leave a comment down below if you're on YouTube. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bull nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.